Hello, I'm Lawrence Baxter, and I'm a member of the Regenerative Crisis Response Committee that has been looking into the question of carbon offsets and alternatives for helping us get to net zero within a time frame that would actively and constructively address the great challenges of climate change. I am a professor at Duke University and a member of various committees that are engaged in looking at the way in which climate change and financial markets interrelate. So this is a special interest for me. The most popular concept in recent years for trying to reduce the carbon emissions and greenhouse gases that promote global warming has been the concept of offsets. That involves trading in voluntary markets between companies and environmental projects, so the companies that are emitting greenhouse gases are able to offset those greenhouse gases by promoting environmentally friendly and constructive activities elsewhere. In theory, that's a very good concept, but in practice, it has many problems and will simply not get us to match the timeline. As you will see there, the longer we delay in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the harder it is going to be to get to what the scientists tell us we have to get to avoid fairly catastrophic consequences from climate change. You will see if we had started last year with active reduction, we would have stood a fair chance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions on a plausible reduction rate of 5% per year by 2045. At this stage, because we did not start that actively enough, we have to reduce even faster to get to net zero. We have to reduce it by 7%. And if we wait until 2025, which is only a couple of years from now, we have to reduce at the rate of 15% per annum. Those are huge hurdles. So the question is, can offset markets actually deliver this result? There have been a number of refinements with offset markets because they do contain lots of problems, one of which is an initiative that former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has been leading, called the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. That task force very admirably attempts to clean up the metrics that are being used so that what we see by way of trade-offs are at least related to reality. What has taken place in the past has been a lot of what we call greenwashing, in which there's been the appearance of a reduction of carbon output or offsetting carbon output, and in reality, it's not happened. And the problem is that that kind of voluntary engagement simply won't work at least on its own, if at all. There are many reasons for that. I've mentioned the problem of confusing and incoherent metrics. There are other problems too. Measuring that actual production is very difficult. Situations of corruption. There has been finagling on the part of either the carbon emitters or those who are offering an alternative investment for carbon reduction. And there is always an asymmetry. We assume that we can measure carbon output and carbon reduction, and if we are accurate enough, they will in fact work to offset each other. But scientists have learned that, in fact, carbon reduction is asymmetric to carbon production in terms of environmental impact, that it takes more carbon reduction to undo the damage of carbon emission. And so that's a big problem. And then another major problem is the pricing of carbon. At this stage, the social cost of carbon is grossly underpriced in these markets. By that, I mean, if you are going to price carbon solely in terms of the output produced by a specific industry or a specific factory, for example, what's not taken into account are all the other social costs allied with it. And so there have been efforts to try to get better pricing for carbon, but those are, of course, resisted heavily by the industries that generate greenhouse gases because it would put up the price of their trading. So a number of different problems apply. While this whole offset market idea is very popular for those, including myself, who really like the way in which markets function, it is by no means complete. We have to look at other alternatives if we want to get serious about meeting the targets that we have to meet to avoid climate catastrophe. So it's not only the case that output knows no geographic bounds, that greenhouse gas emissions float across boundaries as they were and create problems for all of us. That's not the only geographic problem. The other relates to environmental justice. It tends to be the case that the impact of offset markets is more damaging in the long run to poorer countries, countries mostly in the Southern Hemisphere, that we tend to focus a lot on cleaning up air quality and reducing greenhouse gases in affluent areas, whilst shifting a lot of the production of greenhouse gases into poorer areas. And so that raises an environmental justice problem that's also geographic, or tends to be geographic. So moving to a contribution model, this is a different way to approach things, and it's a complementary way. It's not an either-or situation. Contribution markets mandate certain targets. And our experience with mandates is that they actually do work much as they are disliked. And it can be a mix of mandates. It could provide rewards for innovation, and it could provide a staged period of time to give the emitters or the producers of vehicles, for example, or other agriculture is a major area where this takes place too, give them time to adjust. But with a mandated target, adjust they must. So that's one possibility. Linked to that could be targeted offsets for residual emissions. So you refine very carefully where the offsets can take place. And clearly that would be determined according to the kind of challenge that's involved in reducing those greenhouse gases. It's not easy for many industries, and to be honest, we all depend on them. We've all gotten used to flying, for example. Well, we can't have the airline industry simply meet targets overnight. It's a very expensive and it's a slow business. What we can do, though, is to say we'll have targets that become more and more mandatory, whilst at the same time giving you credit in the meantime if you engage in offsets. I would also add that there are some fairly exciting innovations taking place, and we are starting to think big, perhaps for the first time in terms of climate change repair. The Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge, which is actually looking at three major efforts. They're as bold as one can get. One is to refreeze the Arctic. Another is to repair the quality of the ocean so that marine life can regenerate. Another initiative by the Center for Climate Repair is what they call marine cloud brightening, which is devising a system whereby the clouds are naturally brightened so as to reflect some of the heat away from the Earth and therefore to help reduce global warming. Now, these are very bold initiatives, but it's very early days. There is other areas of innovation that are being supported by investors that offer the hope of a much less pollutive economy. And so if we put all of those together and not make the mistake of assuming that offsets are the solution, this gives us cause for hope. We at the Regenerative Crisis Response Committee, we are looking at various possibilities that go way beyond offset markets. And that leaves me with cause for optimism, not for despair, notwithstanding the dramatic challenges that I opened this little talk with.